Early morning, Pacific jungle, 1944. Fog hangs low over a silent swamp that Japanese defenders believed no machine could ever cross. The water is deep. The mud is alive. Then the ground begins to tremble. Out of the mist, steel tracks move where no tracks should exist. American tanks are advancing through water that should swallow them whole. What happens next will shatter every rule of jungle warfare. Stay with this story to the end. By 1944, the Second World War had entered one of its most unforgiving phases in the Pacific. The early shock of Pearl Harbor was long past. The desperate retreats of 1942 had hardened into something far more dangerous for Japan, an American war machine that now moved with relentless momentum across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. The strategic balance had shifted. The United States no longer fought simply to stop the advance. Now it fought to dismantle the Japanese defensive empire island by island. Japan's defensive doctrine in the Pacific relied on geography as much as on firepower. Coral ridges, volcanic rock, dense jungle, and above all, swamps were treated as natural fortifications. Heavy concrete was often unnecessary where nature itself could kill tanks more efficiently than artillery. Mud was not just an obstacle, it was a weapon. Japanese planners understood that armored vehicles, especially medium tanks like the American M4 Sherman, depended on mobility to survive. In deep, waterlogged terrain, that mobility vanished. Engines overheated. Tracks lost traction. Recovery vehicles could not reach them. A tank that sank became a steel coffin. From the early campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, both sides had already learned the brutal physics of tropical warfare. Rain did not fall in storms, it arrived in walls. Roads became rivers. Rivers became seas. Entire battalions could be delayed for days by a single flooded valley. For mechanized warfare, the environment was worse than any enemy formation. Even American commanders initially believed that swamp crossings with tanks were tactically unsound, bordering on reckless. Japanese forces built their defensive system around this assumption. Rather than spread troops thin across open ground, they concentrated along high ridges and jungle trails that forced attackers into narrow, predictable approach routes. Behind those routes lay swamps that were rarely guarded by heavy weapons. They were considered dead zones, areas the enemy simply could not exploit. Any attacker who attempted to cross them would arrive disorganized, vulnerable, and usually without vehicles or artillery support. Yet by late 1943 and into 1944, American strategy had evolved into something far more flexible and dangerous for Japanese defensive planning. The United States no longer attacked island chains head-on where resistance was strongest. Instead, it isolated key positions, cut supply routes, and struck where the enemy least expected it. This method, later known as island hopping, allowed U.S. forces to bypass heavily fortified strongholds and surgically dismantle Japan's defensive perimeter. The battles of Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Cape Gloucester had already shown both sides that terrain alone could no longer guarantee safety. Each new landing brought new engineering solutions. Amphibious tractors crawled ashore where boats previously failed. Portable piers were built in hours. Air supply lines began replacing fragile sea routes. The battlefield was no longer shaped only by geography. It was shaped by industrial power and mechanical adaptation. By the time American forces moved deeper into swamp-heavy environments in New Guinea and later in the Philippines, Japanese commanders still believed that one natural boundary remained absolute: deep, soft, waterlogged ground was the final line that tanks could not cross. Infantry might stumble through. Engineers might struggle with temporary bridges. But armored formations, they believed, would always be stopped cold. American planners, however, were no longer fighting the Pacific War with the assumptions of 1942. By 1944, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had gained priceless experience under fire. They studied soil pressure, vehicle weight distribution, recovery equipment limitations, and the effects of prolonged immersion on engines and transmissions. What had once been theoretical dangers were now technical problems waiting for solutions. The U.S. was also operating within a logistical framework that no other nation on Earth could match. Tens of thousands of vehicles could be shipped across the Pacific. Replacement engines, track links, flotation devices, and entire bridging systems followed close behind. Where one tank failed, another stood ready. Where one engineering experiment collapsed into mud, 10 more followed with improvements. Japanese forces, by contrast, were growing increasingly isolated. American submarine warfare had strangled supply lines. Fuel shortages limited training time. Heavy equipment was difficult to move once in-placed and nearly impossible to replace once destroyed. The longer the war continued, the more Japan was forced to freeze its defensive planning in older assumptions. Swamps remained barriers on the maps because there were no resources to imagine them otherwise. This imbalance between adaptation and stagnation set the stage for one of the most psychologically devastating shocks of the Pacific War. When American tanks finally approached terrain that had been written off as impassable, they were not acting on impulse. They were acting on months of testing, engineering calculations, field trials in U.S. training swamps, and a growing belief that no piece of ground was immune to mechanized assault. The swamp that lay ahead of the advancing American formation in 1944 was not simply a stretch of difficult terrain. It was a line drawn in the Japanese defensive mind, a place where armor was expected to die silently in the mud. For years, that belief had held true across the Pacific. But now, the American High Command was ready to challenge the swamp itself. And behind the quiet confidence that something unprecedented was about to be attempted, crews were already sealing engines, widening tracks, and preparing their machines for a test that had never been proven in combat before. What waited at the edge of that waterlogged battlefield was not just another objective. It was a direct challenge to one of the most trusted assumptions of the entire Pacific War. And soon, steel would meet mud. Long before the first tank ever approached the edge of the swamp, the confrontation between steel and mud had already begun thousands of miles away in training fields, testing grounds, and engineering workshops scattered across the United States. The Pacific War was not being shaped only in jungle firefights. It was being reshaped quietly by calculations, experiments, and relentless problem-solving. At the center of this transformation stood the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. By 1943, their role had expanded far beyond building bridges and clearing roads. They now worked side by side with armored units, studying how tanks behaved in environments that had once been dismissed as completely unworkable. Swamps were no longer treated as forbidden zones. They were treated as engineering challenges. The primary obstacle was not water alone. It was pressure. A fully fueled M4 Sherman weighed over 30 tons. On firm ground, its steel tracks distributed that weight across a wide surface area, keeping ground pressure low enough to prevent sinking. But in saturated soil, the ground itself behaved like a slow-moving liquid. Every inch of forward motion threatened to pull the tank downward rather than carry it forward. Engineers began by measuring soil-bearing capacity in swamps similar to those found in the Pacific. They calculated how much pressure different track designs exerted per square inch. From these studies came one of the simplest but most decisive adaptations: wider tracks. By increasing surface area, ground pressure dropped, allowing tanks to float over soft mud rather than dig into it. It was not buoyancy in the nautical sense. It was physics applied to survival. Waterproofing became the second critical problem. Tank engines were not designed for prolonged submersion of their lower components. Even brief intake of muddy water could destroy an engine in seconds. Crews were trained to seal vulnerable intakes, exhaust systems, and electrical components using specialized sealing compounds and field-installed kits. Breather pipes were extended. Exhaust deflectors were fitted. Every small modification increased survivability in wet terrain. Recovery planning was treated with equal seriousness. Engineers understood that even with improvements, some vehicles would fail. The difference between failure and catastrophe depended on whether a disabled tank could be pulled free fast enough. Specialized recovery vehicles were prepared with heavy winches, steel cables, block and tackle systems, and anchoring equipment that could grip into swampy ground without being pulled loose. Timber mats were stockpiled to create temporary traction paths when mud became too unstable. Training followed engineering. Entire armored battalions were rotated through swamp simulation environments in the southern United States. Florida wetlands and Louisiana bayous became classrooms for Pacific warfare. Crews learned how engines behaved when half-submerged. Drivers learned how to read the surface of waterlogged ground for signs of hidden firmness beneath. Tank commanders learned how to space vehicles to avoid creating suction zones that could trap following tanks. Infantry units trained alongside them. Coordination was essential. Tanks would never operate alone in swamp terrain. Infantry protected recovery crews. Engineers cleared underwater obstacles. Forward units marked safe paths with poles driven into the mud. Every movement was calculated to prevent hesitation once the advance began. By 1944, these preparations were no longer experimental. They were doctrine. Manuals were rewritten. Training films circulated through armored divisions. What had once been labeled an extreme risk maneuver was now planned as a controllable operation with defined safety margins. The Sherman itself proved uniquely adaptable to this new form of warfare. Its high-torque engine allowed steady movement at low speeds without stalling. Its relatively light weight compared to heavier European tanks reduced sinking risk. Its mechanical reliability meant that crews could push it into environments where breakdowns would be far more deadly than enemy fire. Most importantly, it could be repaired quickly in the field with parts that arrived in near-endless supply. Behind every frontline tank stood a logistical shadow force of mechanics, engineers, transport crews, and supply handlers moving across oceans. Fuel shipments, spare engines, replacement transmissions, track links, and recovery vehicles followed the armored units with industrial regularity. Where Japanese forces struggled to replace a single destroyed vehicle, American units could replace entire companies within weeks. Yet even with all this preparation, no American armored unit had yet tested the full limit of these modifications under live enemy observation in deep, continuous swamp terrain. Training had proven that tanks could survive limited swamp crossings. What remained unproven was whether they could emerge from such terrain still able to fight. As the operation approached, crews conducted final inspections in forward assembly areas. Seals were checked and rechecked. Track tension was adjusted for maximum surface contact. Recovery units rehearsed extraction drills in darkness. Infantry units memorized signals for movement through water and mud. Every man involved understood the unspoken truth: if the tanks failed here, they would not merely be disabled. They would be lost to the swamp itself. Still, confidence had replaced doubt. Months of engineering had shifted belief into expectation. American High Command was no longer asking whether tanks could cross the swamp. The only question that remained was how decisively they would do so once committed. And as the armored columns began to roll forward toward the dark, flat shimmer of swamp water ahead, the last barrier separating preparation from reality slowly disappeared into the humid Pacific air. The moment of proof was at hand. For the men inside the tanks, the swamp was not a tactical concept or a line on a map. It was a living force waiting just beyond the tree line. Steel could be strengthened. Engines could be sealed. Tracks could be widened. But none of that removed the simplest fear shared by every crewman who had ever watched a vehicle disappear into mud: the fear of sinking slowly, helplessly, with no room to escape. Inside a Sherman, space was already brutally tight. Heat from the engine pressed through metal walls. The air carried a constant taste of fuel, oil, and sweat. In swamp operations, another threat joined them: water. If the hull was breached or a seal failed, the interior could flood in seconds. Escape hatches were few. The tank that protected them could also become their trap. Drivers bore the most immediate risk. Vision through periscopes was narrow and distorted by condensation. The surface of the swamp often looked deceptively calm, hiding mud so soft it could swallow a 70,000-pound vehicle without warning. Each forward movement demanded absolute attention. Too fast, and the tracks would dig downward. Too slow, and suction would take hold. Tank commanders carried a different burden. They stood partially exposed in their cupolas whenever possible, scanning for signs of firm ground, submerged obstacles, or enemy movement. In swamp terrain, a single hidden log could stop a vehicle dead. A single stalled tank could block the path for all that followed. Commanders had to balance caution with momentum. Hesitation could be as dangerous as recklessness. Infantrymen moved alongside the armored columns at a slower, staggering pace. Water reached their knees, sometimes their waists. Every step pulled against their bodies as mud clung to boots like wet cement. Rifles had to be held high to keep them dry enough to fire. Ammunition was wrapped, rewrapped, and guarded as carefully as food or water. Insects swarmed constantly. Leeches were an ever-present threat. Heat exhaustion was not a possibility. It was an expectation. Yet despite the misery, morale remained steady. These men had already fought through ridges, beachheads, and jungle kill zones. Swamps were simply the next obstacle in a war that no longer allowed retreat. What made this movement different was not the hardship itself but the knowledge that they were about to challenge something the enemy believed impossible. The bond between tank crews and infantry tightened under these conditions. Tanks offered moving cover. Infantry protected the vehicles from close-range threats. Engineers moved among both, knee-deep in water, testing footing with poles, laying temporary mats, and guiding each vehicle along the safest possible path. The advance became a slow, coordinated rhythm of metal, muscle, and calculation. Fatigue accumulated quickly. Muscles ached from constant resistance against water. The heat inside the vehicles became suffocating. Condensation ran in thin streams down interior walls. Crews drank warm water rationed carefully to avoid dehydration without exhausting supplies. Every minute in the swamp felt longer than the last. Yet what overrode physical suffering was the quiet awareness that they were stepping beyond the limit of standard warfare. No training film or field exercise had truly replicated this moment. What they were about to do had never been fully proven in combat. The calculations were sound. The preparations were thorough. But between theory and success lay the living terrain itself. Even so, confidence held. The men trusted their machines because those machines had carried them through worse than anyone once believed possible. They trusted their engineers because those engineers had already broken many such barriers. And they trusted one another because survival in the Pacific had long since become a shared responsibility that no single branch could shoulder alone. As the armored column crept closer to the black mirror of swamp water, engines idled low. Recovery vehicles positioned themselves at calculated distances. Infantry fanned outward to secure the perimeter. Engineers took final soundings of depth and firmness. Every movement became deliberate. Every order was executed without raised voices. There was no dramatic rush toward the water. No surge of adrenaline. Only a controlled, almost unnatural calm settled over the formation. Each man understood the simple truth: once the first tank entered the swamp, there would be no turning back without exposing the entire force to disaster. Ahead, unseen by American eyes, Japanese observation posts still watched quiet water and empty reeds, confident in the barrier they had trusted for years. And as the lead Sherman's tracks edged toward the dark surface, two completely different beliefs about the limits of terrain prepared to collide. For the Japanese defenders, the swamp was not merely difficult ground. It was doctrine made visible. It was a natural extension of their entire defensive philosophy in the Pacific: use the land itself as a weapon, force the enemy to fight the terrain before he could ever fight the soldier. Where cliffs and coral formed walls, swamps formed graves. Japanese field manuals emphasized channeling the enemy into narrow corridors of approach. Jungle trails, ridgelines, and dry ground were mined, registered by artillery, and covered by overlapping machine gun fire. Swamps, by contrast, required far fewer resources. They were left mostly unguarded by heavy weapons because they were assumed to be self-defending. Infantry might struggle through them. Engineers might hesitate at their edges. But armored vehicles were expected to halt completely at the first meters of deep mud. This belief was reinforced by early war experience. In Southeast Asia and New Guinea, armored movement by either side had repeatedly stalled in waterlogged terrain. Vehicles sank. Recovery proved impossible under fire. Tanks abandoned in swamps became permanent wrecks, slowly disappearing beneath vegetation. These early outcomes hardened into certainty. The idea that a sustained armored advance could cross a true swamp under combat conditions never entered serious operational planning. By 1944, Japanese defenses across swamp-heavy regions were built on this foundation of trust in the terrain. Observation posts focused on roads and ridgelines. Artillery was sighted to dominate dry approach routes. Anti-tank weapons were positioned where vehicles were expected to emerge, never where they were believed unable to go. Swamps became the blind edge of the defensive system, watched lightly and at a distance, assumed to be impassable by default. Confidence in this barrier also reflected deeper limitations. Japanese mechanized forces in the Pacific were sparse, lightly equipped, and increasingly restricted by fuel shortages. Anti-tank resources were precious and carefully conserved for decisive choke points. It made strategic sense, within the framework of existing belief, to allow swamps to serve as passive defenses rather than expend scarce weapons guarding them. Psychologically, the swamp also served as reassurance. It was a fixed border between the enemy and the interior of defensive positions. It created a feeling of natural protection in an environment where concrete, steel, and heavy emplacements were often impossible to build at scale. Even in the face of American air superiority and growing naval dominance, terrain offered one of the last reliable forms of security. Japanese observers watched river crossings and beachheads with constant vigilance. They listened for engine noise along jungle trails. They scanned tree lanes for infantry movement. But the flat, silent expanse of swamp water rarely held their attention for long. It was monitored, but without tension. Reports from earlier battles supported this posture. Whenever American vehicles attempted to approach wet ground, they stopped short. Infantry took over. Tanks remained on firmer earth. Swamps slowed advances and fractured formations, buying time for defenders to regroup or withdraw. This repeated pattern confirmed the lesson: terrain could succeed where firepower alone might fail. By the time the American armored formation approached the swamp in 1944, Japanese units in the area had already fought weeks of delaying actions and rearguard engagements. Supply lines were strained. Artillery ammunition had to be rationed. Every shell was counted. Defenses were organized for a familiar kind of assault, infantry probing forward in narrow lanes under the cover of indirect fire. No Japanese field officer expected to see tanks emerge from the water itself. Small observation teams remained posted along the edge of the swamp, more out of routine than alarm. They recorded water levels. They noted weather patterns. They listened for distant movement. But their reports reflected calm, not urgency. The swamp remained quiet. Reed lines stirred only with wind and insects. the water surface remained unbroken. Behind these outposts, defensive positions rested with measured confidence. Machine gun crews checked their fields of fire along dry ground. Mortar teams awaited coordinates for the next expected approach route. Anti-tank teams conserved their weapons for the roads where they were certain armor would one day appear. The swamp, in the Japanese defensive mind, did not require urgent attention. It was a boundary that did not need to be defended because it was believed incapable of being crossed by machines. That belief shaped every placement of men and weapons that day. It dictated where fire would be concentrated, and where it would not. It shaped what the defenders watched closely and what they allowed to fade into the background of assumptions. As the American armored formation completed its final preparations at the swamp's edge, the Japanese still saw only still water and quiet reeds at their forward boundary. They did not yet realize that the terrain they trusted most was about to become the very pathway of their undoing. And as the first vibrations from distant engines began to carry faintly through the humid air, the limits of that trust were about to be tested in the most unforgiving way possible. The lead Sherman eased forward at low idle, its engine note muffled by damp air and heavy foliage. The water at the swamp's edge appeared calm, almost glass-like in the early light, giving no hint of what lay beneath its dark surface. Engineers moved ahead first, probing with long poles, marking a narrow entry lane through submerged grasses and concealed roots. Recovery vehicles took their assigned positions on firmer ground behind, cables already unspooled for immediate use. The first contact between steel and swamp was almost gentle. The tank's forward tracks dipped into water that climbed steadily up the suspension arms. Mud swirled outward in slow, oily ripples. Inside the hull, the driver fed in minimal throttle, careful not to churn the ground too violently. Too much torque would dig downward. Too little would allow the suction of the mud to tighten its grip. As the tank rolled deeper, water climbed to the midpoint of the hull. The widened tracks flattened the soft ground beneath, spreading weight outward instead of driving it down. The principle that had worked on training grounds was now being tested under the quiet pressure of combat. Every inch of forward movement was deliberate. Every gauge inside the vehicle was watched without blinking. Behind the lead tank, the second Sherman advanced at a precisely calculated distance. Too close, and the ground pressure between them would compound, softening the path further. Too far apart, and recovery coordination would become impossible. Infantry formed a staggered line along both flanks, rifles held above the waterline, eyes fixed on the reeds and treetops beyond. At several points, the lead tank's progress slowed to a crawl as the mud thickened. Suction tugged at the tracks. The vehicle's forward motion threatened to stall. Engineers signaled for momentary pauses, allowing the ground to settle under load rather than collapse beneath it. The tank responded exactly as the manuals predicted, settling slightly, then stabilizing as the track surfaces distributed pressure across a broader footprint. What could not be modeled in training was the sheer persistence of the resistance. The swamp did not push back violently. It pulled steadily, patiently, with a force that accumulated without warning. Engine temperatures rose. Condensation dripped from interior surfaces. Crew members wiped gauges with gloved hands, watching for any anomaly that could signal imminent failure. Halfway across the first major section of swamp, the lead tank encountered a hidden obstacle, an old log submerged just below the surface. The left track climbed unexpectedly, tilting the hull several degrees. Mud displaced toward the right side as the tank's balance shifted. For a moment, forward motion halted completely. Recovery protocols activated instantly. Winch cables were secured from the rear vehicle to the lead tank's towing loops. Engineers dug anchoring points into the saturated ground using structural mats and deep stakes to prevent pull-out. At a controlled signal, power from both vehicles combined with the winch's steady pull. The tank lurched forward, slid sideways off the log, and regained traction. The entire evolution took less than 4 minutes, but every second carried the risk of immobilization. Once freed, the lead tank continued its slow advance without stopping. No attempt was made to regain speed. Momentum was maintained only at the level required to prevent sinking. The second tank now entered the same zone, repeating the maneuver with slight adjustments based on the first vehicle's experience. One by one, Shermans followed, threading through a living corridor carved from water and mud. As the formation pushed deeper, the acoustic signature of the movement began to change. Engine noise softened, absorbed by vegetation and thick air. Track vibrations traveled through the water in deep, pulsing waves. What could not be heard clearly at a distance could now be felt across the swamp floor itself, a low, steady tremor moving where no such movement had ever been recorded before. Japanese observation posts along the swamp's margin registered this change not as an immediate visual alarm, but as a subtle disturbance in what had always been silent ground. Ripples appeared on water surfaces that had been undisturbed moments earlier. Birds lifted suddenly from reed beds without visible cause. The swamp itself began to move. Inside the armored column, conditions worsened as depth increased. Water pressed higher against hulls. Leakage around minor seals began at isolated points, quickly contained by crew members with absorbent materials and emergency clamps. The adjustments were minor, but their presence underscored the margin at which this operation balanced. There was no room for cascading failure. A single disabled tank could halt the entire column in this confined channel. Infantry waded carefully along navigable margins, using floating debris for balance. Their role was not only protective but diagnostic. They identified submerged hazards ahead, marked them with stakes, and guided tanks toward slightly firmer ground wherever it existed. Progress became a synchronized movement of armor and human bodies against the resistance of the environment. Time lost its normal meaning inside the swamp. 100 yards might require half an hour of continuous movement. A single mistake could trap a vehicle indefinitely. Yet despite the grinding pace, progress advanced steadily. The widened tracks held. The engines continued to breathe through extended intakes. Recovery systems remained intact. The physics that had been tested in training were proving transferable to reality. Midway through the crossing, the swamp grew deeper still, transitioning from viscous mud to thick, submerged vegetation that resisted the tracks like bundled rope. The resistance increased sharply. The lead vehicle's forward speed dropped to a near standstill. Once again, coordinated effort pulled it through. Block and tackle systems redistributed force. Fuel burned faster at low speeds under high load, but reserves remained sufficient. What mattered most was that none of the tanks had sunk. By the time the lead Sherman approached the far edge of the swamp, water levels began to recede against the hull. The ground beneath transitioned from fluid to soft but supportive soil. Tracks found firmer bite. For the first time since entering the swamp, engine load decreased rather than increased. The tank climbed slowly upward, water cascading off its armor in sheets of brown runoff. Mud peeled from the track guides in heavy clumps. As the hull emerged fully onto stable ground, the vehicle did not pause. It advanced several more yards, clearing space for the next tank to follow. Behind it, the second tank now closed on the same transition zone. Seals held. Tracks held. Recovery teams maintained their positions. The corridor through the swamp, once theoretical, now existed as a proven route. From start to finish, the first successful crossing had taken hours, not minutes. But it had succeeded in the one way that mattered most: the swamp had failed to swallow the armor. Visible now beyond the reeds was firm ground that lay behind the Japanese forward defensive belt. And with each emerging tank, the silent assumption that had shaped the enemy's entire defensive plan began to fracture. The swamp had been crossed. The first moment of realization on the Japanese side did not arrive with shouted alarms or flashing signal flags. It arrived as disbelief. Observation teams along the swamp's interior boundary saw movement where no movement was supposed to exist. Ripples spread across water that had been still for hours. Reed beds bowed and parted against an unseen force. At first, some mistook it for drifting debris or animals disturbed by artillery far away. But the vibrations continued, steady, advancing, mechanical. Then the first armored silhouette broke through the reeds. Mud-drenched steel rose from the waterline where nothing heavier than a man was expected to stand. Tracks, thick with vegetation, turned slowly but relentlessly. Exhaust vapor drifted over the swamp surface in low gray sheets. The impossible had taken physical form in front of them. Within seconds, reports began moving rearward through the Japanese defensive network. The message was simple and difficult to believe: American tanks were emerging from the swamp itself. Defensive doctrine had no immediate response for this scenario. Anti-tank weapons were oriented toward roads and raised ground. Artillery fire plans were pre-registered on dry approach routes, not on waterlogged flats assumed to be impassable. Even when gunners attempted rapid adjustments, the angles were wrong, the distances unmeasured, the targets moving in directions never anticipated. As additional Shermans emerged behind the first, the shock deepened. These were not isolated vehicles lost in mud and wandering forward in desperation. This was a coordinated armored advance, intact, deliberate, and supported by infantry moving through routes the defenders had never used for engagement planning. American infantry surged forward immediately behind the lead tanks, using the armor as mobile cover. Where Japanese units had positioned machine guns to rake narrow land corridors, they now faced armored threats advancing from their unprotected flanks and rear arcs. Fire that had once been expected to shape the battlefield now fell across empty ground. Anti-tank teams attempted to redeploy under pressure, dragging weapons through mud that now worked against them as cruelly as it had once worked for them. Ammunition carriers slipped. Firing positions had to be improvised on unstable ground. The few weapons that managed to open fire did so without the overlapping coverage that Japanese doctrine relied upon for effectiveness. From the American side, the shock translated immediately into momentum. Tanks that had emerged from the swamp with engines still strong did not halt to celebrate success. They advanced at combat speed onto firmer ground, turrets swiveling toward defensive positions never designed to face them from this direction. High-explosive shells struck machine gun nests from angles that bypassed protective earthworks. Infantry followed closely, neutralizing positions stunned by the sudden appearance of armor where none had been expected. Japanese artillery attempted hasty corrections. Observers struggled to find reference points amid the confusion. Fire began to fall, but late and scattered. Some shells overshot. Others fell short. The synchronized rhythm that had defined earlier defensive engagements dissolved under the pressure of an attack that violated the foundational assumptions of the defense. Communications began to falter within minutes. Field telephones were severed by advancing infantry and armor. Runners attempting to move between positions were cut off by the rapid change in the line of contact. What had once been a coherent defensive grid collapsed into isolated pockets reacting independently to an assault they were never equipped to counter in real time. Psychological impact multiplied the physical disruption. Units trained to expect American infantry probing from narrow fronts now faced the full weight of combined arms appearing behind and beside them. The swamp, once trusted as a silent ally, had become a corridor of humiliation and sudden exposure. Some defenders attempted organized withdrawal toward secondary lines, but routes of retreat were already compromised. Tanks now controlled ground that had previously been considered inaccessible. Infantry pushed relentlessly into seams between positions. The carefully constructed geometry of the defense fractured into chaotic engagement at irregular angles. American recovery and support elements followed the breakthrough with disciplined precision. Engineers widened the initial swamp corridor into a functional supply route. Additional vehicles crossed in sequence, converting what had begun as a risky experimental maneuver into a sustained armored penetration. What the Japanese had assumed would be a graveyard for tanks became, within hours, a logistical artery for the advancing force. Resistance remained fierce in isolated positions. Japanese units fought with determination, using remaining ammunition and exploiting any cover that remained intact. But the operational framework that allowed those local defenses to support one another had been irreversibly damaged. Without coordinated fires, without predictable approach routes, and with armored vehicles dominating previously protected ground, even the strongest points of resistance were steadily reduced. By late in the engagement, the battlefield bore little resemblance to the terrain-based defense that had existed only hours earlier. The swamp, once a boundary, now lay behind American lines. The firm ground beyond it, once the protected interior of the Japanese defense network, had become the new front under direct armored threat. Smoke rose from disabled positions and shattered equipment. The air thickened with dust and churned mud. The sounds of combat no longer formed a distant, directional pattern. They came from every direction at once, reflecting a fight that had lost the orderly geography of pre-planned defense. Japanese command at higher levels now understood the scope of what had occurred. The crossing was not a localized anomaly. It was a demonstration that a category of terrain long trusted as an anti-armor barrier had ceased to function as such under modern combined arms pressure. The implications extended far beyond this single battlefield. For American forces, the moment marked a decisive validation. Months of engineering effort and doctrinal revision had now been confirmed under enemy observation and live fire. Tanks had crossed deep swamp, emerged operational, and directly triggered the collapse of a prepared defensive system. By nightfall, the battlefield grew quieter. Isolated fighting continued in pockets where defenders refused to disengage, but the organized resistance along the former swamp line had ceased to exist. What had once been assumed to be an impenetrable environmental barrier had been transformed into one of the most effective avenues of advance on the field. The swamp had not merely failed to stop the armor. It had delivered it directly into the heart of the defense. And as the remaining Japanese units regrouped in shattered formations beyond the broken line, the full weight of what had just occurred began to settle across the battlefield. What followed would not be measured only in ground taken or weapons destroyed, but in a fundamental shift in how terrain itself would be viewed for the remainder of the war. By the end of the engagement, the immediate tactical picture was clear. Ground that had been considered secure by virtue of geography alone was now firmly in American hands. Japanese forward positions that had once depended on the swamp as a silent shield were either destroyed, abandoned, or rendered tactically irrelevant. The collapse did not come from overwhelming firepower alone. It came from the sudden disappearance of a barrier that defenders had trusted more than any wall of concrete. Casualty figures reflected the speed and disruption of the breakthrough. Japanese losses were heaviest in units caught in dislocated pockets, machine gun teams, mortar crews, and command elements positioned to face the wrong direction when the armor appeared. Many were neutralized before they could reposition weapons. American losses during the crossing itself were comparatively limited, a result that underscored just how thoroughly engineering preparation had mitigated what once would have been catastrophic risk. Some vehicles suffered mechanical damage from prolonged immersion, but few were permanently lost. Territorially, the breakthrough forced a rapid readjustment of Japanese defensive lines across the surrounding sector. Positions that had been laid out with the swamp as a natural anchor now stood exposed along their flanks or rear. Within days, Japanese commanders were compelled to abandon or realign multiple defensive belts to account for a threat they had previously dismissed outright. That loss of depth and certainty reverberated through every subsequent engagement in the region. For American forces, the successful swamp crossing did far more than deliver ground. It delivered proof. It demonstrated that environmental assumptions could no longer be treated as permanent truths in modern war. What had once been labeled impassable was now simply unprepared for. The operation validated months of technical innovation and doctrinal change, moving combined arms warfare into terrain once considered immune to mechanization. The psychological effect extended beyond this single battlefield. Japanese defensive planning after this point showed a visible shift. Swamps were no longer trusted as automatic barriers. Anti-tank weapons began to appear in positions previously left almost undefended. Engineers were forced to consider worst-case scenarios instead of best-case assumptions. But these adjustments came too late to reverse the expanding imbalance in industrial capacity and operational flexibility that now defined the Pacific War. American armor doctrine also evolved as a result. Techniques refined during the crossing were formalized and distributed across other theaters of jungle and riverine combat. Track modifications, waterproofing practices, and recovery coordination became standard. The lesson was unmistakable: terrain could be conquered not only by courage, but by calculation. Not only by manpower, but by engineering logic applied without hesitation. At a deeper level, the event illustrated a broader shift in 20th-century warfare. Nature, which had protected armies for millennia through mountains, rivers, and marshlands, was steadily losing its ability to serve as a final shield. Industrial power, mechanical reliability, and technical doctrine were eroding the traditional partnership between geography and defense. The swamp that had once promised safety now offered only false certainty. For the men who fought there, the memory was simpler and far more personal. To the tank crews, it was the day their machines proved stronger than the ground itself. To the infantry, it was the moment the earth beneath their feet stopped limiting the direction of their advance. To the engineers, it was the confirmation that months of unseen labor had saved lives in the open. And for the Japanese defenders, it marked the instant one of the last dependable assumptions of their Pacific defense vanished beneath the same water they had trusted to protect them. The war would continue across islands, ridges, rivers, and jungles, each demanding its own price in blood and endurance. But from that moment forward, no swamp could ever again be regarded as a sanctuary from armored assault. The boundary between machine and environment had been redrawn. In the end, the crossing did not merely change the geometry of a battlefield. It changed the logic of terrain itself. It proved that modern war no longer asked whether the land would allow an advance. It demanded only whether the will, the tools, and the preparation existed to force one. And on that day in 1944, in a place where steel was never meant to survive, American tanks moved forward anyway, and the swamp, at last, yielded.